Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike O'Malley here with a Hurricane Outlook and discussion recorded on June 12th, 2023, recorded on 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a lot of things to jump into today, including what is happening across the Atlantic Basin. We got some new updates there, and look at what might be forming in the Eastern Pacific Basin over the next several weeks. So let's go ahead and jump straight into everything. Taking a wide look across the tropical Atlantic this afternoon, we notice that there's not too much ongoing across the basin, which is certainly some good news for the 12th of June. Couple of waves down there in the intertropical convergence zone, but otherwise than that, there is not too much else to really speak about. A few mid-latitude cyclones, elsewise, really a lot of dry, stable air. You can see all of that orange, that is dry, stable air in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere, preventing any substantial development and pretty strong upper level winds as we'd expect for the month of June. So it is pretty quiet across the Atlantic Basin, which is certainly some very good news. So as you can see out there in the Atlantic Basin, there is no tropical cyclone formation expected over the next 7 days. We are going to be watching a few areas, one in the Caribbean, especially in the northwestern Caribbean towards Central America, and then out in the main development region. We'll talk about these areas here in just a moment, but we will be watching these areas for some potential sort of something. I'm not ready to say tropical development, but we will be watching a few strong tropical waves in the main development region within the next about 7 to 10 days. And potentially a Central American gyre setting up across portions of Central America. Unlikely to spark development, but we'll talk about why here in just a moment. As far as the updated 2023 tropical cyclone impact risk goes, so what we're looking at here is we're looking at an overall probability of one place within 25 miles of any given point. So select a point on this map, and within 25 miles of that point is your chance of being hit by a tropical cyclone, which is a tropical depression, storm, hurricane, whatever. They're all a cyclone. They're all tropical cyclones. So this is your risk of being hit by a tropical cyclone in the year 2023. And there's a few updates to this forecast. We showed this a few months back. The main and primary update with this forecast is to not only increase the risk for Bermuda now from a 40% or 4 out of 10 to a 5 out of 10 chance of being impacted by a tropical cyclone, and also to increase the risk here in the southwestern Atlantic Basin for the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, and the eastern coast of Florida and extreme southeastern Georgia to a 50% or a 5 out of 10 chance. And then to extend this moderate risk all the way up to the North Carolina, to near the North Carolina-Virginia border with a 40% chance for portions of far northeastern South Carolina and into coastal North Carolina. Still retaining 30% probability up here across the northeastern U.S. that this area is always relatively low on any given season. And of course, the same is also true in, where kind of the opposite is true out here in the Gulf of Mexico, where there's always generally a high probability of formation and somebody getting impacted. 8 out of 10 chance closer towards the Florida Peninsula. And in fact, we've already seen impacts from Tropical Storm Arlene that formed out here. So this has already, in some sort of way, objectively, subjectively, already verified. And then also we are watching the southwestern part of the Gulf of Mexico, the Bay of Campeche, and the western United States Gulf Coast for a 7 out of 10 probability of being impacted by a tropical cyclone. Fairly low odds out here in the southern Caribbean and the central Caribbean, still the central and eastern part of the Caribbean with a 60% chance. And I really think that's akin to earlier in the season, as we have early season tropical activity before the El Nino really takes hold out across this area and prevents significant organization and maintenance of tropical cyclones. So what we're looking at here, this is the GFS high resolution forecast. We're looking at the precipitable water firstly. So we're looking at the amount of moisture that is in a theoretical column of the atmosphere. The warmer the colors indicates the higher moisture content in the atmosphere, more precipitation and more moisture throughout the entire depth of the atmosphere. We're also looking here at the 300 millibar wind, which is the arrows in here. All of these arrows that my cursor is going to indicates the direction of the wind here, and also you're looking at the wind speed. If the wind is not at a certain threshold, which is 34 knots or 40 miles per hour or greater, there's no arrows. But again, when in the context of tropical cyclones, 34 knots is pretty strong. So what we're looking at here is we're starting off with today's forecast. We'll go ahead and run this forward. And you notice the slug of tropical moisture that does come into Central America, which unfortunately is not highlighted out very well here, but this is Central America. That's Panama right there, Chile, and this is basically South America, and that's the equatorial Pacific. So we notice what we're kind of like looking at is this slug of tropical moisture that gets slung around here into the southern Caribbean and piles into Central America. And what tries to form is we notice that all this tropical moisture slews from the ITCZ into Central America, and because of the frictional convergence of the land, it begins to slow down. You notice that the wind speeds here, or the wind speed at the surface would actually be a lot less over here than it would be over the water. So you start to get a piling up of the surface winds here that basically increases convergence at the surface and divergence aloft, which promotes thunderstorm activity. And we notice that by the end of this forecast period, you notice that something tries to spin up there in the portion here of the Caribbean. But we notice at this time that, we're dealing with a lot of shear, 28 knots here of shear, 21 knots of shear. And you notice the direction that these wind barbs would be pointing to. They're generally all out of the north here. So you're getting a lot of northerlies here from north to south flow like that. And that's not going to allow for tropical cyclone genesis. And the trade winds as well through here are going to be a little bit stronger, probably 15 to 20 knots at this time. So development chances out here in the Caribbean are not currently favored. 28 knots, 21 knots of shear in this entire area, even 13, 19 knots here, 15 near Cuba. This isn't going to be particularly favorable for development. And also there's going to be some dry air that would be circulating down from the continental US down here eventually. So this is very unlikely to develop, and it would surprise me. We've been talking about how the GFS has a long-standing bias of just spinning up these spurious vorticity bits and aggregating it into a tropical cyclone, upscale in the model, after some time. That's a lot of convective feedback problems that the GFS has been known to have. So again, it keeps pushing back development. This is a big X, not really anticipating development. Now, if we actually look back out here in the tropical Atlantic, there is a couple of things that we're going to be watching. First of all, we notice that there's a lot of dry air and a lot of shear currently. We notice this is what the pattern is. There's screaming winds here, generally 40 knots, 38 knots here. Very unfavorable atmosphere for any type of tropical activity. A lot of dry air, a lot of shear. We move this forward in time, however, we notice that the GFS does actually have a stronger tropical wave coming off here. This is by the 17th, so just here in a few days, a strong tropical wave emerges off the coast of Africa in just about 7 days, or less than that, about 5 days actually. And so what this is going to end up doing is this wave will be traversing the Atlantic, and we notice at this time that the shear is going to be strongest to the north, but if this wave stays a little bit further to the south, it will have shear to contend with. There is no doubt about that, but the shear is going to be a lot weaker. And as such, in the forecast model, this wave actually tries to spin up into something kind of back here. There's a lot of tropical moisture that gets flung around this system, and another wave emerges and kind of basically merges with this other system, a lot of complex interactions, and you might just very well get some type of development out here. We'll look at the ensembles here in a minute, but even the European has been trying to indicate some development out of that. And in the East Pacific Basin as well, there is likely or probably going to be a cyclone that develops, in fact, maybe even two cyclones that develop out here as larger scale rising motion begins to take hold over this area. So taking a look here at the European ensemble mean sea level pressure, all of these red numbers here, this indicates an area of lower pressure and where there's an actual pressure drop that is measurable in the forecast computer model. We run this forward. This is beginning here at hour 30. So this is Tuesday, tomorrow at 2 a.m. Move this forward here, and we notice that in the forecast model, this is hour 138. So this is well within the 7-day range now used by NHC. Here's an area of possible disturbance, a few little pressure drops here indicated by the ensemble models. And again, this particular ensemble guidance here has 51 different members, all initialized with different parameters and run out in time to give us an idea of what might happen. So when you start to see the majority of members pick up on something, you know that that's probably going to be what we're dealing with. So we continue this forward out in time. This is just beyond, this is at the 7-day period right now. So this is by next Monday, or the really Sunday night going into early Monday morning of next week. And we have what looks to be a very traceable area of low pressure in the tropical Atlantic at this point. Sorry, I forgot my words for a second. That happens from time to time. But generally speaking, we have a noticeable pressure drop here in the tropical Atlantic. Maybe some hints of a Central American gyre setting up here on the European ensemble within 7 days. Not too worried about this area, so I'm not going to really talk about it too much. But this definitely does have my interest. And if we go out really in time to roughly about day 8, there's a noticeable area here, not only in the Caribbean, but also within the tropical main development region. So again, the Caribbean I'm not really focused on. I don't think we're going to see development out of this. And this is about 8 to 9 days from now. So the forecast is very murky out here. Not focused on that. But this is definitely the strongest signal that I've seen so far for any MDR activity. And for this to happen in June is rather unprecedented and would paint a little bit of an ugly picture for what might be coming later in the season. And real quickly here, looking at the Eastern Pacific Basin and what might be happening, we're looking at the 200 millibar wind pattern in the upper part of the atmosphere. Just real quickly looking at the favorability that is going to be setting up across the Eastern Pacific over the next while. We notice that by about day 5 here, this is day 5, 120 hours from now, especially within the eastern part of the basin, very favorable upper level easterlies here. And also notice the very cyclonic outflow with another potential system developing out here in the central part of the basin. This system is very short-lived, as there's going to be a lot of upper level flow out here that the storm will be running into. We talked about how there's also a lot of cooler and more stable marine layer here. The sea surface temperatures are much cooler in this area, so this system probably won't get too strong. But we notice within just a few days, this is about 6 days from now, there's a developing hurricane here in the Eastern Pacific, at least according to the GFS. And this is not entirely out of the realm of possibility. Pretty much you will have some shear across this area. In fact, if we look at what it would look like across the vortex average sounding, there is going to be a little bit of upper level shear, roughly about 12 to 15 knots. But notice that there's not a whole lot of change in the direction of that. So this is generally a more favorable pattern to support potential for some tropical cyclone genesis at this point, and could very well support the first tropical system of the Eastern Pacific Basin. No threats to land at this point, but we will certainly continue to monitor this system. So one final look here at the Eastern Pacific Basin, we notice how the intertropical convergence zone has actually lessened with the extent of the dry stable air. We notice there's a lot of dry stable air out in portions of the northern part of the basin and southern part near the equatorial Pacific. Elsewise, though, we also notice that there is a large amount of shower and thunderstorm activity perking up here in the Eastern Pacific Basin, and this will probably result to our first tropical cyclone of the EPEX season, the Eastern Pacific hurricane season, forming within a few short days, more than likely. So I would not be surprised to see something mentioned from the Hurricane Center a little later this afternoon or over the next few days. All right. So that being said, I do hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and evening. Of course, I am Michael O'Malley. God bless. Take care. I'll talk to you guys again some more over the next several days.